I can't. I just can't hug her. That smell of old age. It makes me sick to my stomach. The words, quiet and sharp as shards of glass, pierced the silence of the hallway. I froze, my hand hovering halfway to the doorknob. I'd only come back from my old woolen shawl, the one I'd left on the armchair in the living room. Behind the door, in the room that still smelled of my apple pie and their Sunday laughter, my daughter, Laura, was saying these words to her husband. It wasn't a cry, not a complaint, but a tired, disgusted confession. Something inside me, something warm and alive that had held me together for 78 years, cracked, splintering into 1,000 cold fragments. I slowly lowered my hand, never touching the knob. The shawl, knitted by my own mother, suddenly felt heavier, as if it had absorbed all the bitterness of that moment. I didn't go out to them. I turned silently and, stepping as noiselessly as a ghost in my own home, returned to the kitchen. Their laughter, drifting from the living room, now sounded like a foreign, distant hum, like a radio tuned to a station where I no longer existed. On the table sat the plates with the remnants of our celebratory lunch. I walked to the sink and turned on the tap. Warm water ran over my hands, the hands that had rocked Laura to sleep, that had held her as she took her first steps, that had wiped away her tears. The aroma of apples and cinnamon, which only an hour ago had been the scent of home, now seemed artificial, theatrical. I began to wash the dishes, plate by plate. The squeak of the sponge, the rush of the water, the quiet ticking of the old clock on the wall, these sounds became my entire world, a thick wall that sealed me off from the voices in the next room. I felt nothing but the methodical movement of my hands and a chill slowly spreading from my chest. I heard them getting ready to leave, the click of the front door, the sound of their car starting up and driving away. When the sound finally faded around the corner, I turned off the water. My hands were red from the heat, but I felt no warmth. I took a clean cloth and meticulously, inch by inch, wiped down the countertop, erasing every crumb, every drop they had left behind. I wasn't washing away leftovers. I was washing away their presence. When the kitchen was perfectly clean again, I brewed myself a single cup of chamomile tea. Not 2, not 3, 1, for myself. And I sat at the table, staring out the window at the empty street, where the evening sun cast long, lonely shadows. The warmth of the cup in my palms pulled me back into the past. Memories that once warmed me now burned with shame. There we were, sitting at this very table 5 years ago. On it lay the yellowed documents for the land, the part of the property that stretched down to the river, my father's inheritance. Laura, holding my hand, spoke quickly, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Mom, it's for the grandchildren, for their future, so they can have a perfect room, bright and spacious. You understand, don't you?" I understood. I saw a dream in her eyes, and my mother's heart melted. The next day, I signed the papers. $40,000. I remember the feel of the cold pen in my hand and the thought that I was investing this land, this piece of my past, into their future. Back then, my heart was filled with pride in my generosity. Now, I felt only a cold draft where that land used to be. Another memory, warmer and therefore even more painful. My grandson, little Tom, was sick, a high fever, and he cried, refusing to be held by anyone. Laura was distraught. I came over, took him, hot and trembling, into my arms, and for hours I paced the room with him, holding him close, rocking him, humming a quiet tune. My touch, the warmth of my body, soothed him. He fell asleep on my chest, his breathing finally evening out. I remember how my back ached, how my arms went numb, but I was afraid to move, afraid to wake him. In that moment, I felt needed. My arms were a sanctuary. Now, I understood that for my daughter, it was just functional, an instrument for calming a child, useful, but temporary. I finished my tea, the bitterness of the chamomile mixed with the bitterness in my throat. I felt like a leper in my own home. I whispered into the silence, a person no one wanted to touch. The worst part wasn't what she said. The worst part was that I suddenly recalled all the moments over the last few years when she had pulled away, when her hugs became shorter, more formal. I realized it hadn't been accidental. My body, once a source of comfort, had become a source of disgust. She didn't see a mother. She saw old age. I wasn't family. I was a resource that had been depleted and was beginning to spoil, giving off an unpleasant odor. Suddenly, the cold inside me was replaced by a strange, icy calm. My thoughts became sharp and clear. I went upstairs to my bedroom. In an old wooden chest under the bed, among yellowed photographs and letters, lay a folder of documents. I took it out. My fingers, trembling slightly, found the right page. The deed of sale for this house. The paper was cool and crisp. In the owner field, there was only one name. Mine. Hazel Granger. This was my house, not their future inheritance. Mine. The one tool I had ignored for years now felt like my only weapon. I returned downstairs, sat in my armchair, and dialed a number from a business card that had been in my phone book for years. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. Yes, Mr. Adams, this is Hazel Granger. I'd like to make an appointment. I'm interested in a consultation regarding a lifelong maintenance agreement. After a brief conversation, I hung up. Then my gaze fell on the family photograph on the mantelpiece. All of us together, smiling, at my 75th birthday party. I walked over, carefully removed the photo from its frame, turned it face down, and hid it in a drawer. I didn't tear it. I simply removed it from sight. That night, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer an emptiness that needed to be filled with the voices of others. It became my space, my fortress. I realized I hadn't lost a family. I had simply said goodbye to a version of my family that had only ever existed in my memory. The office of Mr. Adams was a sanctuary of quiet order. The scent of old leather and polished mahogany hung in the air, a stark contrast to the lingering, ghost-like aroma of apple pie and betrayal in my own home. Sunlight, filtered through heavy blinds, cut clean, dusty lines across a vast desk. There were no family photos here, only framed diplomas and rows of thick, serious books. It was a room where emotions were translated into clauses and feelings were filed away under legal precedent. I sat in a firm, leather chair, my back straight, my hands resting calmly on my purse. My heart was not pounding. The tremor that had lived in my fingers since Sunday was gone. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a consultation, Mr. Adams. A man with kind eyes and a face etched with professional discretion looked at me over his spectacles. Mrs. Granger, he began. You mentioned on the phone you wished to discuss your estate planning, a lifelong maintenance agreement, specifically. I met his gaze without flinching. Yes, I said, my voice even and clear. I want to ensure my home is transferred to someone who will provide care, my niece, Eleanor, and I need to draft a new will. The old one no longer reflects my wishes. There was no hesitation, no crack in my voice. I was not a grieving mother. I was a client. This first step was the cornerstone of my quiet repair. The days that followed were a series of methodical, deliberate actions, A checklist I ticked off with a resolve that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. It wasn't revenge, it was restoration. My legal repairs were the most significant. In Mr. Adams's quiet office, we dismantled the architecture of my old life, brick by brick. He explained the terms of the lifelong maintenance agreement with clarity. The house, my house, would be legally transferred to my niece, Clara, a warm, gentle soul who still sent me handwritten letters in exchange for her commitment to my care in my later years. It wasn't a gift given in expectation of love, but a contract based on mutual respect. "This is ironclad, Hazel, Mr. Adams assured me, tapping a thick stack of papers. "It protects you, and it solidifies your wishes beyond any challenge." We drafted the new will, leaving my remaining assets, the savings I had so carefully guarded, to a local children's charity and a small endowment for the hospital's neonatal unit. Laura's name and the names of her children were not mentioned. Each signature I placed on the crisp, important documents felt less like an act of exclusion and more like an act of careful curation. I was simply tidying up my legacy. Next came the financial repairs. The bank lobby was bright, impersonal, and loud with the sounds of commerce. I stood at the counter, the cool marble steadying beneath my elbows. When the teller, a young woman with a polite, practiced smile, pulled up my accounts, I felt a brief, sharp pang. As she typed, preparing to remove Laura's name as a secondary user from my main checking account, a memory ambushed me. Laura, as a little girl, standing on a stool in this very bank, her pigtails bouncing as I taught her how to fill out her first deposit slip for her piggy bank money. The memory was so vivid I could almost smell the sweet, chalky scent of her childhood shampoo. The ache was real, a ghost of a touch on my heart. But then I remembered the chill of the hallway, the casual disgust in her voice, and the memory dissolved. The ache receded, replaced by the same icy calm. "Please also change the beneficiary on my retirement savings account," I said, my voice unwavering, "and I'd like to set a new password for my online access." I watched her name disappear from the screen. It was just a string of pixels, but it felt like erasing a debt. The final part of the structural repair was physical. I called a locksmith, a young man who arrived with a heavy toolbox and a respectful nod. He worked efficiently, the sounds of drilling and metal scraping echoing through the quiet house. I stood by the window, watching him replace the locks on the front and back doors. Each turn of his screwdriver was a definitive sound, severing one final, invisible cord. When he was done, he handed me a set of new keys. They were shiny and sharp in my palm, heavier than the old ones. That evening, as I turned the new deadbolt, the solid, resonant click was the most reassuring sound I had heard in years. It was the sound of a boundary being drawn, the sound of safety. In between these appointments, I found solace in the earth. I spent hours in my garden, my hands plunged deep into the cool, dark soil. I pulled weeds with a steady, relentless rhythm, yanking out the stubborn roots of dandelions and thistle that choked my rose bushes. The physical work was grounding. My hands, the same hands she had scorned, were caked with dirt, yet they felt cleaner than they had in years. This was a touch that was honest and productive. As I worked, my neighbor, a kind woman named Eleanor, leaned over the fence. "Your roses are looking magnificent this year, Hazel," she said, her smile genuine. "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. They just needed a bit of attention. We spoke for a few minutes about the weather and her new grandchild. It was a simple, easy connection, a reminder that the world was not a cold place, only certain corners of it were. The calls started on Wednesday. I saw Laura's name flash on the screen and let it go to the answering machine. Later, standing in the kitchen, I pressed play. Her voice, laced with a syrupy, manufactured concern, filled the room. "Mom, it's me. I've been trying to reach you. Are you all right?" We're all so worried. A pause. "Listen, something strange happened. I got a notification from the bank. It seems my access to the account was, well, it's probably just a mistake. Call me back when you get this." I listened, my face impassive. She wasn't worried. She was alarmed. The resource had just gone offline. I calmly deleted the message, without a second thought. That evening, I undertook the symbolic repairs. I pulled a cardboard box from the attic and began to sort through the memorabilia I kept in the sideboard. I found Laura's birth certificate, her first lost tooth in a tiny velvet pouch, a lock of her baby hair. I looked at each item, acknowledging the love that had been real once. I did not destroy them. I placed them carefully inside the box, along with the smiling family photos. On the lid, I wrote in neat black marker, "History." The past was not something to be erased, but it was no longer the present. It was an archive. Then, I found the volunteer application for the local hospital. It was a program I'd read about years ago for cuddlers who held newborns in the neonatal unit who needed human contact. My fingers traced the words on the form. This was where my touch could be a gift again, not a burden. I filled it out, my handwriting steady and purposeful. My final repair of the week was small, but it was entirely my own. I drove into town, not for an appointment, but for myself. I parked the car and walked to a small French bakery I hadn't visited since my husband passed away. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful welcome. The air inside was warm and smelled of butter, sugar, and yeast. Behind the glass counter lay rows of exquisite pastries. My eyes landed on a perfect, glossy lemon tart, its yellow curd bright as sunshine. "Just one, please," I told the baker. I didn't take it home. I walked to the small park across the street, sat on a bench in the warm afternoon sun, and opened the white pastry box. The tart was a perfect circle of sweet and sour, a small, bright indulgence. As I took the first bite, I closed my eyes. It wasn't a victory. It was a choice. My choice. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence was not lonely. It was earned. The insistent knocking began on Saturday morning. It was a sharp, impatient sound that shattered the peaceful quiet of the house. I was in the living room, sitting in my favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea warming my hands and a book open on my lap. I didn't move. Through the sheer curtains, I could see Laura's car parked at the curb, its silver paint glinting in the bright morning sun. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. "Mom, are you in there? The key won't work. Open the door." Her voice was strained, a mixture of confusion and rising irritation. It was the voice of someone whose key had always worked, someone who had never considered the possibility of a lock being changed. I took a slow sip of my tea. The chamomile was soothing. I watched as she peered through the side window, her face pressed against the glass, her expression a mask of disbelief. She called my phone. I watched it vibrate on the small table beside me, her name flashing on the screen, and did not answer. She was not a stranger locked out. She was a consequence, knocking on a door that was no longer hers to open. I remembered a phrase my own mother used to say, her voice gentle but firm. "If they won't hear you when you speak softly, they will hear your silence much louder." Her banging finally subsided, replaced by the frustrated crunch of tires on gravel as she drove away. The silence that rushed back into the house was profound. It was the sound of a chapter closing. With the house finally, truly mine again, I began a slow, deliberate inventory of my life within its walls. It was not a painful task, but a necessary one. like a librarian archiving old volumes. I started in the small upstairs bedroom that had once been Laura's. The air was still and smelled faintly of dust and dried lavender. I ran my hand over the worn wooden headboard of the single bed. A warm memory surfaced instantly. Laura, 6 years old, tucked under the covers, her face glowing in the light of a bedside lamp as I read her a fairy tale. I could almost feel the phantom weight of her small head on my shoulder, hear her sleepy sighs, but as my eyes drifted to the window, a colder memory took its place. Laura as a teenager, standing right there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of scorn. "I can't wait to get out of this house," she had said, her words a casual teenage cruelty that I had dismissed at the time, but which now stung with the clarity of hindsight. "It's so old." Everything smells old. I stood there for a long moment, allowing both memories to exist at once, the warmth and the chill, the love and the rejection. From there, I moved to the living room and stood before my husband's old leather armchair. Its surface was cracked and softened with age, molded to the shape of a man I had loved for 50 years. I remembered him sitting there, laughing as a tiny Laura tried to climb onto his lap, her little hands gripping his sturdy fingers. He would lift her up effortlessly, and her giggles would fill the room. The chair was a monument to that warmth, but it was also the chair Laura had wanted to get rid of after he passed. "It's an eyesore, Mom," she'd insisted, her voice devoid of sentiment. "It doesn't match anything. We could get you a nice new modern one." She hadn't seen a vessel of memory. She'd seen outdated furniture. I gently ran my hand over the worn leather one last time, a silent thank you and goodbye to the man who had shared this life with me. My final stop was the kitchen, the heart of the home. I stood at the wooden table, its surface scarred with decades of life-knife marks from hurried breakfasts, a faint ring where a hot pot had once been placed, a tiny heart carved into one leg by a bored 8-year-old Laura. This table had seen everything: birthday cakes with melting candles, homework spread under the warm glow of the overhead light, tearful confessions over late-night cups of tea. It was the stage for our family's entire history, but it was also where I had sat, alone, after hearing her words, the taste of apple pie turning to ash in my mouth. It was where the illusion had shattered. After this quiet tour through the palace of my memory, I took a small notepad from the kitchen drawer and a pen. I sat at the table and made a short, simple list. On one side, I wrote, "To keep." On the other, "To leave." The list of things to keep was surprisingly short. The next day, I began to pack. The process was methodical, a quiet ritual of preparation for the future. I brought down a sturdy box from the attic. I wasn't packing clothes or furniture. I was packing the essence of what I wanted to carry forward. I went to the garden and carefully dug up a small, vibrant rose bush, a descendant of the one my mother had planted on my wedding day. I wrapped its roots gently in damp burlap, my fingers careful not to damage the delicate structure that held its life. This was not just a plant, it was my lineage, a living piece of my history that would bloom again in a new place. Next, I gathered the items from my to keep list. My mother's old woolen shawl, the one that carried the smell of old age, I folded with reverence, its familiar texture a comfort against my skin. I packed my husband's favorite book, its pages soft and worn, and finally, I packed the completed application for the hospital's volunteer cuddler program. I placed these items into the box, arranging them with the care of a museum curator. This was not a box of old things. It was a starter kit for a new life. On the side of the box, in the same neat black marker, I wrote a single word: future. When the last piece of tape was sealed, I looked around the room. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house no longer felt empty. It felt clear. It was a space prepared for new stories, stories that would be written without me. My own story was waiting to be continued elsewhere. The days after sealing the box labeled Future were filled with a quiet, forward momentum. I was no longer dismantling the past. I was actively constructing a new present. On Monday, I called the hospital and confirmed my start date for the volunteer cuddler program. On Tuesday, I sat on my porch, a local newspaper spread across my lap, and circled a listing for a small, sunny one-bedroom apartment in town, closer to the library and the park. The idea of leaving the house that held so many ghosts no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a liberation. As I sat there, sipping my morning coffee, I watched the world go by without the familiar ache of waiting for a car that would never again turn into my driveway. I found myself thinking of Laura not with anger, but with a kind of distant melancholy. I realized I didn't miss her, not the woman she had become. I missed the idea of her, the 6-year-old with bright eyes, the memory of a daughter that had lived more vividly in my mind than she had in reality. Letting go of that ghost was the final, quietest repair of all. The unexpected call came on Thursday afternoon. It was an unfamiliar number, and for a moment I considered letting it go unanswered, but some instinct made me pick up. "Grandma?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, fragile. It was Tom, my 16-year-old grandson. It was a voice I had not heard without his parents' confident chatter in the background for a very long time. There was a long, awkward pause. I wanted to say I'm sorry. The words hung in the air between us. The old Hazel would have rushed in immediately, soothing him, telling him it was all right, that he had done nothing wrong. But the old Hazel was gone. I remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. Then I asked gently, my voice calm and even, "Thank you, Tom. Can you tell me what you're sorry for?" My question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation for him to look deeper than a simple, reflexive apology. There was another pause, longer this time. I could hear his shallow breathing. For not saying anything," he finally stammered. When she said those things, and for all the times I pulled away, when you tried to hug me, I didn't want her to get mad at me." It was a clumsy, teenage confession, but it was honest. It was the first crack of genuine light in a wall of cold indifference. "I see," I said, my voice still gentle. "That must have been difficult for you." I agreed to see him, but on my terms. "You can come over tomorrow afternoon, Tom. But just you. We'll have some tea." He arrived precisely at 3. He stood on the doorstep, shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his shoes, looking less like the confident teenager I was used to and more like a lost child. I led him into the kitchen, the same room that had been the scene of my silent fracture. The atmosphere was not warm and familial. It was polite, a little awkward, like a meeting between two people learning each other for the first time. I poured him a cup of tea and placed a plate of simple shortbread cookies between us. The taste of butter and sugar was a return to something basic, something honest. He struggled to find the words. She's really mad," he said, staring into his cup. "About the house, the money. She says you've lost your mind." I listened without comment, simply nodding. He looked up at me, his young face a roadmap of confusion and guilt. "I always loved your hugs, Grandma. They always made me feel safe. But, Mom," she started saying things a few years ago about how it was unhygienic, immature. I just started copying her, I guess. It was easier. You wanted to belong, I said softly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, an offering of understanding without absolution. His eyes welled with tears. Yeah, he whispered. I did. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the ticking of the clock and the quiet sip of tea. I wasn't angry with him. I saw a boy caught in the crossfire, a boy who had chosen the path of least resistance, as so many of us do. Finally, he looked at me, his gaze direct and pleading. Can I still come and see you? Can things go back to how they were? Here it was, the crucial test. I reached across the table, but instead of taking his hand, I gently pushed the plate of cookies toward him. You can always come and see me, Tom, I said, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched my lips. But things can't go back to how they were. They have to be better. You can come, but not because you feel obligated, and not for my pies. You can come for this, for an honest conversation, for the truth. That's the only thing I'm serving in this house now. He nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his face. When he left, I wrapped 3 shortbread cookies in a napkin and handed them to him. It wasn't a peace offering to the old family. It was the first small provision for a new, more honest relationship. As I watched him walk down the path, I thought about the walls we build to protect ourselves. I had built mine high and strong, but perhaps some walls aren't meant to be fortresses. Perhaps their purpose isn't to shut everyone out forever. Maybe some doors don't need to be bolted shut. Perhaps they just need to be carefully locked from the inside, leaving a small window ajar, open only for those who learn to knock gently, and who are brave enough to come alone. The day I signed the lease was crisp and bright, the autumn air carrying the clean scent of distant wood smoke. I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A pair of tailored gray trousers, a soft cashmere sweater in a deep forest green, and the simple pearl earrings my husband had given me on our 30th anniversary. They were not sentimental choices. They were armor. They spoke of quiet dignity and enduring substance. The real estate agent, a brisk and professional woman named Sarah, met me at the apartment. The moment I stepped inside, I knew. The space was filled with light, pouring in from large windows that overlooked a small, well-tended park. It smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, a scent so different from the layered, ghost-filled air of my old house. The sounds were different too, not the heavy silence of memory, but the gentle hum of a neighborhood alive, with quiet activity, the distant laughter of children in the park, the soft rustle of leaves. I walked through the rooms, my sensible shoes making a soft, purposeful sound on the polished hardwood floors. The kitchen was small but efficient. The bedroom had a perfect nook for an armchair and a reading lamp, and the living room felt open and welcoming. Sarah began her sales pitch, pointing out the new appliances and the ample closet space, but I barely heard her. My decision had already been made. It wasn't a logical assessment of square footage or amenities. It was a visceral recognition. This was a place where Hazel Granger could live, not just exist. I'll take it, I said, my voice firm, cutting her off mid-sentence. Back at her office, the scent of strong coffee and printer ink filled the air as I signed the documents. The pen felt cool and solid in my hand. With each stroke of my signature, I wasn't just securing a new home. I was signing my own declaration of independence. As a final, symbolic gesture, I paid the deposit and the first month's rent not from my old joint savings account, but from a new one I had opened last week. An account that had only ever had one name attached to it, mine. That evening, I was in my garden, carefully transplanting a few hardy perennials into pots to take with me, when I heard his car pull up, Laura's husband, Mark. He was the passive antagonist, the silent co-conspirator who had enabled her cruelty with his quiet agreement. I did not go to the door. I continued my work, my fingers deep in the cool, rich soil. I heard his footsteps on the porch, followed by a hesitant knock. "Hazel, it's Mark. Can we please talk?" His voice was muffled through the heavy oak of the door. I straightened up, wiping my earthy hands on my apron, and walked into the living room, but I did not approach the door. I simply stood, listening. "Look, Laura Island, she's not herself." He continued, his voice strained. "This whole thing has been a shock. We were just worried about you." "Worry is a strange way to describe it, Mark," I said, my voice calm and clear, easily carrying through the door. "When you learned about the bank account, was it worry you felt, or was it inconvenience?" There was a long silence from the other side. He had no answer. "And when you heard about the house," I continued, "was it concern for my well-being, or for your future inheritance?" Another pause. We always thought," he stammered. "You thought this house was yours." I finished for him, my voice devoid of malice. It was a simple statement of fact. "You thought my resources were yours. You were mistaken." I heard him sigh, a sound of utter defeat. "She's your daughter, Hazel." It was his last, desperate attempt at manipulation. "Yes," I said softly. "She Island, and I am her mother. I am not her bank, her property, or her retirement plan." There is nothing more to say. I heard his footsteps retreat down the steps. When the sound of his car faded, the strength I had worn like armor finally gave way. It wasn't a collapse, but a controlled release. I sat down in my armchair, the one where I had made so many decisions, and I cried. The tears came not from a place of fresh pain, but from a deep well of old, unmourned sorrows. I cried for the daughter I thought I had. I cried for the years of self-deception. I cried for the love I had given so freely that had been treated so cheaply. It was not a storm of weeping. It was a quiet, cleansing rain. It lasted for exactly 7 minutes. And when it was over, I felt a profound sense of peace. The last of the ghosts had been washed away. The next day, my 2 oldest friends, Eleanor and Margaret, came for tea. Their presence filled the house with a warmth it hadn't known in years. We sat in the kitchen, the scent of Earl Grey tea and Eleanor's lemon cake perfuming the air. The conversation was easy, flowing from Margaret's hilarious story about her battle with a stubborn squirrel in her bird feeder to Eleanor's quiet joy over her grandson's first steps. They didn't press me for details about Laura. They simply created a safe space for me to exist as myself. After a while, I took a deep breath. "I'm moving," I announced quietly. They both stopped, their teacups hovering mid-air. I told them everything, not in a tone of complaint, but as a simple narrative of events. When I finished, Margaret reached across the table and covered my hand with her own, her touch firm and steady. "It's about damn time," she said, her voice fierce with loyalty. Eleanor just smiled, her eyes shining. "We'll help you pack," she said. In that moment, surrounded by their unwavering support, I understood. I had not lost a family. I had simply finally recognized the one that had been there for me all along. Laura arrived 2 days later. She didn't knock. She used the key Mark must have had, the one I had forgotten to retrieve, and let herself in, her sense of entitlement walking a step ahead of her. She stood in the doorway of the living room, where I was carefully wrapping my mother's porcelain tea set in tissue paper. She was dressed in a sharp, immaculate blazer, her face a mask of cold fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "I'm packing," I replied calmly, not looking up from my work. "You're selling my home," she accused. "I'm selling my home," I corrected her gently, finally meeting her gaze. It was never yours, Laura. That was a story you told yourself. Her face tightened. The manipulations began. After everything we've done for you, all the years we've taken care of you, this is how you repay us? What about your grandchildren? You're stealing their future. I placed a teacup carefully into the box. Taking care of me? I asked, my voice still quiet. Was it taking care of me when you took $40,000 of my land to renovate a room? Or was that an investment in your own property value? Your children's future was never my responsibility to secure, Laura. It was yours. She shifted tactics, her voice softening into a venomous imitation of concern. Mother, you're not well. You're old. You're being manipulated by that lawyer, by your niece. You don't know what you're doing. On the contrary, I said, pausing to look directly at her. For the first time in a very long time, I know exactly what I'm doing. I am protecting my assets and securing my right to a life of dignity. Those are legal terms you might want to learn. Her face contorted with rage. This was the final, desperate gambit. You'll die alone, she spat, the words meant to be a curse. No one will want to be near you. You'll be that bitter old woman with that smell. And that was the moment, the pivot upon which my entire life turned. I stopped packing and stood up, facing her fully. I was no longer a mother being scolded by her child. I was a sovereign entity. That smell you find so repulsive, Laura, is the smell of a life lived. It smells of baking bread and garden soil and tears and laughter. It is the smell of the arms that held you when you were sick and the hands that signed over their future to pay for yours. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word was a perfectly sharpened blade. You were never disgusted by the smell of old age. You were terrified by the scent of your own obligation. You saw my humanity as your burden. I walked over to the desk and picked up a single crisp piece of paper. It was a copy of a donation receipt. You were worried about your inheritance, I said, holding it out for her to see. Don't be. It's already gone. I've endowed a new cuddler program at the neonatal unit in your name, the Laura Granger Wing for Unwanted Children. Now, your legacy will be to provide the comfort to strangers that you refused your own mother. The color drained from her face. She looked at the paper, then at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had no more weapons. Her arsenal of guilt, manipulation, and fear was empty. She turned, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the house. I did not watch her go. I walked to the door and closed it, the new lock clicking into place with a sound of beautiful finality. The door closed behind her like the final punctuation on a very long sentence. I felt neither joy nor sorrow, only a profound stillness. This wasn't the silence of loneliness that I had once feared so deeply. It was the silence of sovereignty. The final threads of my old life were snipped, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet efficiency of bureaucracy. The call from Mr. Adams came on a Tuesday morning. "It's all done, Hazel," he said, his voice imbued with a professional satisfaction. "The sale of the house has closed, the funds have been transferred to your new accounts, and the endowment to the hospital is officially established. As of this moment, you are the sole decision-maker in every inch of your life." The words landed not with the weight of responsibility, but with the lightness of liberation. I thanked him, my voice steady and grateful. Later that day, I made one last trip to the old post office box I had shared with my late husband. I handed the key to the clerk, a woman who had known me for 30 years. She looked at me with kind, questioning eyes. Closing it up for good, Hazel? She asked. Yes, I replied with a small smile. I'm having my mail delivered directly to my door now. It was a simple, practical act, but it felt monumental. I was no longer waiting for messages in a shared, locked box. My life was now coming straight to me. Tom came to the old house one last time to help me with a few last boxes. The atmosphere was entirely different from his first hesitant visit. We sat on the floor of the nearly empty living room, surrounded by neatly packed cartons, sharing a simple lunch of sandwiches and lemonade from a flask. The space, stripped of its furniture and memories, no longer felt heavy. It was just a shell, waiting for a new family. Dad's not talking to Mom, Tom said quietly, breaking a piece of crust from his sandwich. He says she went too far. Mom just keeps saying you abandoned the family. I took a slow sip of my lemonade before answering. She's not wrong, in a way, I said thoughtfully. But I didn't abandon the family. I abandoned the role I was expected to play. She doesn't miss me, Tom. She misses the version of me that existed to serve her needs. He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed object. It was a pencil sketch, beautifully rendered. It depicted a pair of hands, wrinkled and strong, gently cupping a small, thriving rose bush. My hands. I made this for your new place, he said, his voice thick with emotion. So you remember that your hands are for growing things. I took the drawing, my fingers tracing the delicate lines. Tears pricked my eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound gratitude. This simple gift, made by his own hand, was more valuable than any inheritance. Thank you, Tom, I whispered. It will have the most important spot on my wall. The morning I left the house for the last time was bathed in a soft, gray dawn. The rooms were hollow and echoed with every soft footstep. I walked through each one, a silent pilgrimage through my own history. I ran my hand along the sun-faded wallpaper in the hallway, touched the cool glass of the window where I had watched my children play, and stood for a moment in the center of the kitchen, remembering 50 years of life and love and loss. But there was no pain, only a quiet, deep-seated gratitude for the shelter the house had given me. On the clean kitchen counter, I left the single, old front door key. Beside it, I placed a small, handwritten note. It didn't say goodbye or express any lingering hurt. It simply read, "May this home be as kind to you as it was to me. May you fill it with a new and better love." I walked out the front door, closing it gently behind me, and I did not look back. Arriving at the new apartment felt like coming up for air. The movers were already there, their cheerful chatter a welcome sound. The building manager, a friendly woman named Maria, met me with a smile and handed me a small pot with a single blooming orchid. "Welcome home, Mrs. Granger," she said. The gesture was small, but it was a seed of community, a sign that I was no longer an isolated matriarch, but a new neighbor. The first box I opened was the one I had labeled Future. I carefully unwrapped my mother's woolen shawl and draped it over the back of the armchair that had been delivered that morning. Then I placed Tom's drawing on the mantelpiece, its simple beauty instantly making the strange new walls feel like home. And finally, I took out my electric kettle, filled it with water, and plugged it in. As I waited for it to boil, the simple, promising hum filled the sunlit room. A week later, a new rhythm had established itself. One afternoon, while unpacking a box of my husband's books, a small, folded note fell out from between the pages of his favorite poetry collection. I recognized his familiar, steady handwriting immediately. It was from years ago, written on a day I had been feeling lost and unappreciated. It read, "My dearest Hazel, never forget that your heart is the true foundation of this family, but a foundation must also support itself. Be your own home first. Reading those words now felt like a blessing from the past, a confirmation that the difficult path I had chosen was the right one. The next morning, I woke with the sun and decided to bake bread. For decades, the ritual of baking had been an act of service. Today, it was an act of self-care. I kneaded the dough slowly, feeling the life in it beneath my palms. The rhythmic work was a meditation. As the warm, yeasty scent filled my small, bright kitchen, I felt a simple, profound joy. I was not baking for a family gathering or a holiday. I was baking for myself, because I wanted the simple pleasure of a fresh slice of bread with butter and jam. Later that afternoon, Tom stopped by. It was his third visit, and it already felt like a comfortable routine. He didn't come with expectations or demands. He came with a broken bicycle chain and a request for my help. We sat on the small balcony, the city sounds a gentle backdrop, and worked together, my old, steady hands guiding his young, eager ones. There was an easy camaraderie between us, a new relationship being built on shared moments and mutual respect, not on obligation. As we finished, he looked out at the park, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "Is this what peace feels like, Grandma?" he asked. I thought for a moment, watching a leaf drift down from a tree. "Not all of it," I replied with a gentle smile. "But this is a very important piece of it, yes." I didn't miss the old house. I didn't miss the weight of unspoken resentments or the carefully constructed smiles. And I certainly didn't miss the old version of myself, the one who whispered, "Maybe next time they'll see you." Because now I saw myself, and I no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist. There is a point in the life of a tree, after a long and brutal winter, when the sap begins to rise again. It is not a violent or sudden event. It is a quiet, internal shift, a silent decision to live that precedes the first green bud. My own transformation felt much the same. It was not born of a single, dramatic storm, but of a long, cold season of realizing that the branches I had sheltered for so long were drawing the very life from my roots. The final act of this quiet rising was not about closing doors, but about turning the very walls of my old life into a bridge for others. The call from Mr. Adams confirming the final transfer of the funds from the sale of the house was, like the rising sap, an internal event. I felt no surge of victory, no thrill of wealth. I felt only a quiet rightness, the feeling of a tool finally being put to its intended use. The next day, I walked into the downtown office of the Women's Emergency Shelter. The space smelled of strong coffee, disinfectant, and a faint, underlying scent of resilience. I sat across a worn wooden desk from the director, a woman with tired, intelligent eyes that had seen far too much. I did not tell her my story. The check I placed on her desk told its own. It was not a donation. It was a redeployment of resources. She looked at the sum, her professional composure momentarily cracking. "Mrs. Granger, this island, this is transformative. It's for the women who have to leave in the middle of the night," I said, my voice soft but clear. "It's for buying them new shoes for the long road ahead. I had shed my tears for that house long ago. This was not an act of grief. It was an act of intention. I was not demolishing my past. I was using its stones to build a sanctuary. My new apartment, once a blank canvas, was now becoming a home, and more than that, a haven. Its transformation was confirmed by Tom's visits. He started coming not just for tea, but for refuge. One rainy Saturday, he arrived with a small cardboard box under his arm, his expression a mixture of shame and relief. "Can I keep this here, Grandma?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. "Mom," she went through my room. She threw out my sketchbook, said it was a waste of time. I took the box from him without a word and placed it on the top shelf of my linen closet. It was a symbolic act. My home was now a vault for his burgeoning self, a place to store the parts of him that were too fragile to survive in the toxic climate of his own house. We sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Do you think they'll ever change?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I thought of Laura's cold fury, of Mark's weak complicity. "That's a difficult question, my dear," I replied, choosing my words with care. Perhaps a better one is, can they ever stop pretending? The person they are when they think no one is watching, that is who they truly are. The rest is just a performance. He nodded, a sad wisdom dawning in his young eyes. When he left, the box remained, a silent testament to the trust we were building, a foundation stronger than any house. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Laura's. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. But curiosity, or perhaps a need for final, definitive closure, made me open it. The letter was not the angry tirade I had expected. It was a rambling, disjointed confession of confusion and regret. It spoke of sleepless nights, of a hollow feeling in her perfect house, of a sudden, terrifying vision of her own old age. She wrote that she missed my Sunday pies. She wrote that she was sorry. I read the letter twice, slowly. There was no anger in me, no desire for retribution, but there was no rush of forgiveness either. Her sorrow was real, I believed, but it was the sorrow of an empress who suddenly finds her kingdom empty and her subjects gone. It was the loneliness of a resource now fully depleted. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the back of my desk drawer, alongside old receipts and forgotten warranties. I would not answer it. Her apology had a right to exist, but it did not have the right to demand entry into my new life. It could live in the drawer, a quiet artifact of a past I had survived. My 79th birthday arrived not with a fanfare of forced celebration, but with the gentle quiet of a sunrise. I woke up in my own bed, in my own apartment, and the first feeling was not one of expectation, but of peace. There were no anxious glances at the phone, no waiting for a perfunctory call. I made myself a small stack of pancakes, drizzled them with maple syrup, and ate them by the window, watching the city wake up. It was a feast for one, and it was perfect. That afternoon, Tom arrived, his face beaming. He handed me a clumsily wrapped gift. Inside was a small, hand-painted clay pot. In it was a single, tiny succulent, a plant known for its resilience and its ability to thrive in the harshest of conditions. Tucked into the soil was a small, handwritten card. It read, "For someone who learned to grow in the shade." "Happy birthday, Grandma." We shared a pot of tea and he told me about his plans to apply to art school, his voice full of a confidence I had never heard before. He was no longer just copying. He was creating. As he was leaving, he paused at the door. "You look different, Grandma," he said, tilting his head. "Happier." I smiled. "I feel settled," I said, like a person who has finally stopped bracing for impact. My days settled into a new, gentle rhythm. They were composed of small, quiet joys. I spent my mornings reading in the armchair, my mother's shawl draped over my shoulders, a cup of hot tea always within reach. The rose bush I had brought with me, once struggling, was now thriving in a large pot on my balcony, its deep red blooms a daily reminder of endurance. Eleanor and Margaret came for cards every Friday, our laughter filling the small apartment, a sound far richer than the hollow echoes of my old dining room. One afternoon, a text message appeared on my phone. "Happy birthday," from Laura. I read it, and then, without anger or any emotion at all, I deleted it and went back to watering my plants. That night, before I went to sleep, I opened the new journal I had bought for myself. On the first page, I wrote down the thoughts that had been crystallizing in my mind for weeks, a final answer to the unspoken questions that had haunted my old life. They had been disgusted by the smell of my age, frightened by the weight of my love. They had seen my life as a resource to be managed, a story to be curated for their own benefit. Now, if they were to ask me what I learned from all of this, I would finally have the answer. I learned that a life is not a legacy to be left for others, but a table to be set for oneself. I learned to bake my own bread, to pour my own tea, and to keep the door open, always, but only for those who know how to knock with clean hands.